Good afternoon. This session is on the reintegration program. So this is a little bit different from what we have been talking the whole day on economic policies. This is a policy on a very important segment of the Philippine economy, which is the overseas Filipino workers. And this research that is going to be shared to you this afternoon is a collaboration between different researchers under the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development and commissioned by the Frederick Naumann Foundation. And this afternoon, we are also going to have as panel Assistant Secretary Venasio from the Department of Migrant Workers. Okay, so we will invite him after the presentation. So this presentation will be made by my colleague, Dr. Jeremiah Opiniano, who is the Director of the Research Cluster in Culture Education in the University of Santo Tomas. So I'll invite Dr. Opiniano to make the presentation.
Good day to everyone, and we thank the Philippine Economic Society for bringing us all live here at Novotel Hotel. Our research team is humbled that this specialized topic, the return migration of Filipinos, of over 2 million of them, is to be presented before all of you. Courtesy of the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung for Freedom Philippine Office, we will present nearly a generation of migrant reintegration efforts by the world's most organized migration management bureaucracy, the Philippines. That is because the first 2 years of this COVID-19 pandemic saw the country getting swamped by the return migration of our compatriots who got affected by the wrath of SARS-CoV-2. We haven't seen such massive return migration like this, dwarfing the sending of workers abroad that has become the Philippine economy's safety valve, salvation, and major steering wheel since 1974. Before I continue, I beg for your indulgence if I'm not an economist. My consolation is that economics has been among my base disciplines in the interdisciplinary analysis of international migration and development issues in the Philippines. So, on behalf of Dr. Alvin Ang, Dr. Mayor Caroline Magante, and Ms. Maria Isabel La Militante, I will try to make the case that migrant reintegration is the elephant in the room that has been wanting to get out. In this respect, we will do 3 R's today. 1, reporting 2 years of Philippine government assistance to pandemic hit returnees. 2, retrospecting 39 years of migrant reintegration efforts that have now reached the pandemic era. And 3, revealing the current efforts to reconfigure Philippine migrant reintegration. These 3 R's will allow us later on to recommend bolder steps for the short and medium-term future of migrant reintegration. How timely that this presentation happens during Economic and Financial Literacy Week this week. This policy study assesses migrant reintegration and is banked on packaged datasets and compiled historical accounts on how the Philippines has been assisting returning overseas workers. We conducted documentary analysis of present and previous data on reintegration efforts. We conducted some key informal interviews with migrant reintegration stakeholders. Finally, we implemented participant observation of running events, including an event yesterday on reforming migrant reintegration policy and programs. This policy study ran side by side with the ongoing transition period for the Department of Migrant Workers, of which we have here Assistant Secretary Venasio Legazpi. Can you give him a round of applause, please? Thank you very much. Plus, with an ongoing United Nations program for the Philippines related to reintegration. Let us report on migrant reintegration during the first 2 full years of the pandemic, beginning on the 16th of March, 2020, when the Philippines declared an enhanced community quarantine and the novel coronavirus's name became SARS-CoV-2. Migrant workers, non-migrant workers who are permanent residents abroad, and deceased migrant workers whose remains were repatriated formed the 2,337,741 overseas Filipinos who went home. Of the total, some 1.835 million land and sea-based workers came home. Even if you combine the 2020 and 2021 deployment of new hire and rehired overseas workers, which is around 1.225 million, return migrations dwarf migrant worker deployments for the very first time. The Philippine government's migration machinery suddenly turned to reintegration and to handling returnees. If you remember, the IATF, which is kind of inactive lately, formed a task group on management of returning overseas Filipinos to handle their quarantine and their eventual return to their communities and residences. And because of the number of returnees, agencies within and outside of the Philippine migration governance circle have rolled out interventions, entrepreneurial credit, cash grants, business training, financial education, vocational technical education and training, and psychosocial services for returnees. This gamut of interventions suddenly saw Philippine migration policy pivot to migrant reintegration, which, prior to the pandemic, was regarded by analysts as the weakest link in migration governance. Note that the COVID-19 case counts can incur double counts, including Filipinos who may have contracted the virus at least twice. At the same time, returnees may have availed some or at least two of these programs and interventions. So, with caveats like these, about 728,826, and that may be an underestimate, of these returnees got assistance. But the economic crunch the pandemic had brought on families set in. This begs the question, will they stay or leave home? Next slide. The International Organization for Migration did a non-probability survey of over 8,300 returnees. Next slide. About 48% of those surveyed ranked remigration as their top priority. So for a separate draft paper, Alvin and I ran a logistic regression. Next slide. To test a model where returnees will stay or remigrate if, number one, they have received government support, if they have received capital and business training, and if they have a desired type of income activity, if they have received final pays and separation pays, and if they were terminated, and if their assessments of how challenging staying at home is are favorable or not, given the perceived drop of their incomes. Logistic results confirm, next slide, the desires of surveyed returnees to remigrate, even if they have received economic reintegration support from the government. This result implies that international migration becomes a necessary income source for returnees to recoup incomes and lost jobs. In a sense, too, the Philippines may continue to need international migration so that the country's Avengers continue doing their heroic deeds. The pandemic response from migrant returnees, next slide, prompted us to retrace what the Philippines has been doing since the 1974 Labor Code of the Philippines institutionalized policies on overseas employment. We found that in 1983, the former Welfare Fund, the Welfare and Training Fund for Overseas Workers, started with a psychosocial program of organizing families of migrant workers into self-help groups, livelihood and entrepreneurship counseling interventions, as well as providing information on small-scale businesses followed in 1984. After the first People Power Revolution, the Welfare Fund launched a livelihood program called SEED in 1986. When the Well Fund was renamed the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration in 1987, a Center for Family Assistance Services was formed to begin targeting OCW, that was the old name if you remember, Overseas Contract Worker Families. It was also in 1987 that the Department of Social Welfare and Development first received our compatriots who were deported from Southern Malaysia. In the old days, next slide. That's the history. Next slide. Economic reintegration programs for OCWs form part of approaches with labels such as livelihood programs, micro interventions for poverty alleviation, or social safety net programs. The old term for migrant integration by government is called the Reentry Program. OWA then expanded the reach of its livelihood programs with its first economic reintegration program with the acronym REPROIM, or the Reentry Program for Overseas Contract Workers through Economic Mediation. OWA acted as a wholesaler and retailer of these loans until the mid-1990s, when the agency coursed their funds through government-run and countryside financial institutions. Other economic reintegration programs were then launched, and this included one-off inter-cooperation with agencies within and outside the family of the Department of Labor and Employment. Next slide. Migrant reintegration came into play during major crises: the 1990 Gulf War, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2003 severe acute respiratory syndrome or SARS epidemic, the 2007-2008 global financial economic crisis, even the 2006 Lebanon crisis, and the 2011 Arab Spring. This is not to mention that the exploited and abused workers had to be rescued and repatriated, and so are seafarers hostaged by pirates. Over the years, the Philippines has mastered the art of repatriating distressed migrant workers, now called OFWs in this new millennium. Next slide. Migrant reintegration also got its first policy mandate with Republic Act 8042, when that act mandated the setting up of a replacement and monitoring center. But as reintegration programs continued, mandates went unfunded. Next slide. Observations of below 70% repayment rates for credit programs surfaced. Local and foreign assessors of economic reintegration programs in the 1990s also wondered if these programs impacted on the lives of returnees. Organizationally, there prevailed no dedicated office for migrant reintegration. Well, OWA just implemented its usual welfare and economic programs, whether they're reintegration related or not. Change came, next slide, in 2007, when the Labor Department established the National Reintegration Center for OFWs with support from the International Organization for Migration. Some 5 years earlier, civil society groups lobbied that government adopt a framework called the Comprehensive OFW Reintegration Program, or CORP. When the droves of returnees, next slide, came in after the global economic crisis of 2008, the Philippine government handled them with what it usually does: repatriation through rescue efforts and mercy flights, transport services and temporary shelter upon arrival and return home, and economic and social reintegration interventions. Meanwhile, migrant deployment had been increasing, and so are the remittances from overseas Filipinos. And as the years progress, next slide, other government agencies have been launching social protection programs for overseas Filipinos and establishing offices and sending personnel abroad for welfare provision. The National Economic and Development Authority in 2019 devoted an entire chapter in its updated Philippine Development Plan, seen outside, for overseas Filipinos. That plan cemented the government's recognition of international migration as a development phenomenon in general, and of the mandates for migrant reintegration in particular. Migration agencies then slowly integrated the CORP framework in prevailing reintegration work. But the dedicated Migrant Reintegration Office had its share of organizational transitions. Next slide. The Replacement and Monitoring Center went unfunded in 1988. And then DOLE appointed a dedicated undersecretary for migrant reintegration. Then the NRCO was established in 2007 and put it under the Labor Secretary's office. When 122, Republic Act 122 came, the NRCO was placed under OWA in 2010. It was only in 2013 that they got a full staff plantilla. In 2016 and 2015, there's a department order that strengthened the work of the NRCO and placed it back at the office of the secretary. And in 2016, Republic Act 10801 gave OWA its own charter, and the NRCO became an attached office of the OWA. All these transitions in the 2010s happened while NRCO rolled out economic and psychosocial reintegration programs of what OWA and other agencies do. All these transitions were happening, next slide, when the Philippine economy was already in a streak of high macroeconomic growth, and yet migrant reintegration remained under individual migration agencies and under a menu of interagency programs. Next slide. The IOM then played a role in 2017 with the 2-year program called AIRPO over there. A master plan for reintegration was developed, hoping that this will reinvigorate the work of the NRCO. And currently, under a United Nations family program, next slide, called BRIDGE, or Bridging Recruitment to Reintegration and Migration Governance. That is what is happening right now. If the approach of BRIDGE works soon, returning overseas workers will view an online OFW reintegration advisor. If you are distressed, returning home permanently, retiring, remigrating, and waiting either to be re-employed or to become self-employed or to invest back home, a gamut of government agencies is ready for each of these types of returnees. But migrant reintegration framework had evolved. Next slide. The core continued while the United Nations Global Compact on Migration in 2018 carried one of 21 objectives focused on readmission, return, and reintegration. The framework on reintegration was becoming broader. Such breadth, next slide, is now like a big elephant in the room that you would wonder if the room still fits or not. And now that the Department of Migrant Workers, next slide, will soon receive its first budget in 2023, a new set of economic and psychosocial programs on reintegration is to be rolled out. And these are the 7 agencies merged into one. However, the mandate given by Republic Act 11641 that created the Department of Migrant Workers is full cycle reintegration. It means that the mindset to prepare for the eventual return to the homeland starts right before the migrant worker leaves overseas. All of a sudden, next slide, migrant reintegration is now, previous slide, sorry. Migrant reintegration is now thrusted into the entire migration cycle, pre-departure, on-site in the host country, and return to the motherland. The room is getting smaller. Overseas Filipinos scatter themselves in over 200 countries and ocean-flying vessels. Demand for migrant reintegration programs may soon burst. And when the over 2 million migrant workers who went home during these first 2.5 years of the pandemic sets in and reminds us of what needs to be done, next slide, migrant governance had to pivot itself for them. And agencies had to present their menu of economic and psychosocial programs left and right. Quarantine and transportation services alone became an interagency affair. So the framework, the scope, and the scale of returnees all warranted new approaches. So going back to my elephant metaphor, the size of the room simply wasn't enough. And after we have done some historical retrospecting, 39 years of migrant reintegration, we believe that it has to carry a new phase on year 40 next year. And when the Philippine Overseas Employment Policy reaches its golden anniversary in 2024. Of course, the Philippine government continues to hand out cash grants, credit, skills training, and psychosocial programs. You would only wonder if these work or not on a massive scale when income pressures escalate and when business activities have yet to return to a pre-pandemic normal. We go back, next slide, to what migration analysts have long said. Reintegration is the weakest link in migration governance. But with a 39-year experience in migrant reintegration, is it the weakest link? We think, next slide, that the Philippine migration reintegration system is hampered by organizational constraints, by program implementation and program impact concerns, by stunted efforts at interagency coordination to make it a broader mandate, and perhaps the absence of data that can aid in the overall reintegration effort. But to say, however, that the Philippine government did not have a deliberate program for reintegration may not do justice to the nearly 4 decades of migrant reintegration initiatives by our Filipino civil servants, past and present. Implementing reintegration programs for that long a time even comes way ahead of international organizations' efforts to institutionalize reintegration among the origin countries of migrants. The Philippines has now to a point, however, next slide, that the overall migrant reintegration effort must unleash its fullest potential. previous experiences of within agency reintegration programs, or one-off packages stunt the growth of reintegration as a development intervention for the Philippines. Migrant reintegration has to operationally expand to essay better intergovernment agency coordination and to entice broader multi-sectoral efforts. We put forward specific recommendations, next slide, for the ongoing and prospective return and reintegration programs. Should entrepreneurial credit and cash grants continue, these must be carefully implemented and their outcomes dutifully monitored. More psychosocial reintegration programs may have to be launched. Bringing down reintegration programs regionally and locally is the way to go. Reintegration is also not anymore about the returnee, but it's also about the current overseas migrant worker. Next slide. Labor market information becomes relevant for returnees seeking employment at home because having data on returnees' occupations and demographic profiles prior to their first or repeat migration becomes a premium need. Private sector and civil society initiatives for overseas Filipinos and for returnees must expand. And since there was already a master plan on reintegration 5 years ago, while there are ongoing efforts to reconfigure reintegration, that master plan must be revisited. But we have one major recommendation to put forward. Next slide. Because the room for migrant integration must be bigger. That will be done through promoting migrant reintegration in current intersectoral development strategies of government for the entire population and given relevant national policies. One, psychosocial reintegration can be anchored on relevant efforts such as the National HIV and AIDS Plan, the Young National Migrant Health Plan, a Young Mental Health Plan, and the Universal Healthcare Law. On the economic dimension of reintegration, the Department of Trade and Industry has had 3 editions of the MSME Development Plan and is finalizing a 4th one under this new government. And the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas has included overseas Filipinos in the 1st and 2nd editions of the National Strategy on Financial Inclusion. And yes, there is a legal dimension to migrant reintegration because returnees exploited abroad seek legal redress at home, seek also money claims, and seek case resolution in courts. A current law on having a 30-day voluntary conciliation and mediation, plus the usual rules and regulations of the old POEA must prevail. But to cover both economic and social reintegration, the Philippine government, next slide, has a decade of implementing a broader, more coordinated effort on what is called social protection. Social protection is a set of policies and programs that seek to reduce poverty, inequality, and vulnerability to risk and enhance the social status and rights of the marginalized by promoting and protecting livelihood and employment, protecting against hazards and sudden loss of income, and improving people's capacities to manage risks. And there are 4 social protection program responses to address life cycle risks, economic risks, environmental and natural risks, and social governance risks. Labor market interventions seek to enhance employment opportunities and protecting the rights and welfare of workers. Examples include job facilitation and livelihood programs. Social assistance covers preventive and developmental programs that support the minimum basic requirements of the poor and of various sectors, excluded, discriminated, and marginalized, like crisis interventions for women or transit homes for trafficking victims. Social insurance programs help mitigate income risks by pooling resources and spreading one's handling of risk across time and classes. Examples include pensions and health insurance. Finally, social safety net programs are stopgap measures or mechanisms or urgent responses that address the effects of risk on specific vulnerable groups, like those displaced by typhoons, or the more recent quarantine facilitation efforts by the national and local governments. And since social protection has been an interagency effort by the Philippine government, labor market, social assistance, social insurance, and social safety net programs have been identified for overseas Filipino workers. The saying, embracing social protection as a framework, approach, and overall strategy encompasses migrant reintegration. Social protection can be the bigger room that can accommodate the multifarious needs of migrant reintegration. Thus, next slide, the Department of Migrant Workers and the current UN programs may have to actively promote migrant reintegration in these development interventions. because Philippine migrant reintegration has evolved into a broad-ranging migration and development intervention that covers multiple dimensions, inextricably linked to varied areas of Philippine socio-economic development. For nearly a generation, migrant reintegration is lodged in a cocoon found within the migration management bureaucracy that inhibits its growth and its fullest potential for Philippine development. The pandemic has provided such overall lesson for migrant reintegration as that long-standing migration and development issue that cannot be contained anymore to within migration management. When SARS-CoV-2 becomes endemic, we hope the Philippines finally implements what is perhaps the most extensive and comprehensive approach on migrant reintegration to date, mainstreaming migrant reintegration into other corollary and related areas of Philippine development will all the more senior returnees and current migrant workers feel the care of an entire homeland government that addresses the reintegration and their other socio-economic development needs. And before we hear Asek Legazpi speak, thank you very much and remember Wakanda forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Opiniano. Would like to invite now Asek Venancio Legazpi here on stage, and also Ms. Sofia Atanasio of the Frederick Naumann Foundation to give their comments and their observation on the presentation. So Asek Legazpi.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I am from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and we have chosen to support this study because we are a German political foundation that focuses on democracy, human rights, rule of law, and economic freedom, as well as governance and other topics related to development. And we noticed that as with the research that was presented today, there are really a comprehensive history on reintegration efforts for overseas Filipino workers. But due to the pandemic, everything was disrupted. So these returning migrant workers have a difficulty in reintegrating and returning to their normal lives, as they want to either stay or remigrate. So we decided that this study is really important in terms of finding out how to generate and propose policies that will hopefully, through the Department of Migrant Workers, will mainstream reintegration for those who are having difficulty in their lives as they were repatriated through the pandemic.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Venancio Legazpi, and I'm an OFW for 29 years in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I started working there in 1993 as an accountant and retired as a vice president in a bank. So it's just one company. And of course, I came this year in March, and was invited to join the Department of Migrant Workers as Assistant Secretary for Reintegration under Secretary Madam Susan Toots Opley. Well, I myself actually, at some point in time when I was on the other side of the fence, because I am also an advocate, always asked the government what we can expect from the government when we go back home and reintegrate. Now it's another, it's like at 360 degrees. And I'm glad that we have here study from presented by Dr. Jeremiah, and I've seen how important is reintegration really, because in the past, what I have experienced is that we sometimes only focus on the side of those distressed or in the stressful situation and who are already here. This time is no longer, the same approach, because based on Republic Act 11641, which is under Section 17, it's a full cycle national or comprehensive national reintegration program. So it's very challenging, and maybe I will be asking Dr. Jeremiah or what, then we'll see. Thank you.
Yes, we hope that the study contributes by we will provide the DMW access to this study as well.
All right, so we'd like to open the floor for any questions on the study, if you have any. Alex, recognize.
I feel like I'm the resident discussant already for the day. My question is, Stephen Covey had these 7 principles of 7 habits of highly effective people. And the first one is says, begin with the end in mind. So I'd like to twist that around, begin with the very beginning, which is, why do our people, 10% of the population, have to end up looking for work elsewhere in the first place? Diba? Because there are no opportunities here. Secondly, even if they have, we produce so many nurses, and yet we pay them only minimum wage. Deliberately, with the awareness that hindi naman tatagal yan kasi aalis din naman yan eh. So they are not given any significant pay increases. Tapos the government will even say put a cap on the number of people who can go out, which is actually an unconstitutional way of preventing free movement of people. Di ba? So to me, the question of reintegration has to also answer the very first question from the beginning. Kasi kung yung reason for them to leave exists, pagbalik nila, di ganun pa din, wala pa rin silang trabaho. Or whatever trabaho they get is very low paying, which is not even enough to support themselves. No? So just like ASEC Vinicio, I worked with the bank for 28 years, and I oversaw the startup of our remittance operations from 10 years ago. And even, sinasabi nga ni Doc Jeremiah, yung sa umpisa pa lang, di ba, meron kaming PIDOS. This is the Pre-Departure Orientation Seminar. Dapat doon pa lang, inumpisahan na pag nando ka na, we only give them a briefing on how to send money. Di ba? Kasi may kita ka, may savings ka pa doon. Lahat ng overtime mo sa'yo yun. Di ba? Di ba? Yung 70% sa pamilya mo, sa regular salary mo yun. So may sarili kang kitty. Okay. The problem is this. If they are not properly prepared with a pre-departure financial literacy, then by the time umuwi sila, wala pa rin silang savings. There is no asset for them to bank on to even start a business or something like that. So, Doc Jeremiah, I understand, napaka-elaborate ng iyong mga slides, but I would like it really simplified. Ano talaga yung heart of the matter? prepare them before they go. What do they need to have? Kasi for example, as Dr. Jerry Sikat said, while we have, for example, loans in our consumer bank for housing loans, our savings bank has about 30% sa OFWs, di ba? And then yung mga seaman, merchant marine, meron din. So being able to save, to invest in those for cars, for houses, is actually a form of durable equipment or capital formation activity. Okay yon, and the banking system has been contributing to that. Pero meron ba kaming papel sa reintegration nila? Wala eh. Kasi by that time, kung umuwi ka na at wala kang naipon, we're not talking about anything. Di ba? So I thought, Doc Jeremiah and Asek Legaspi, my challenge to you is, can you be more proactive and solve it? Hindi yung nakauwi ka na, saka mo sasabihin, anong gagawin ko? Di ba? I think it's too late in the game for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Sir. Pareho pala tayong nagtrabaho sa banko. Kaya in-encourage talaga niya na mag-save. Ganun tayo eh. And of course, kagaya ng sabi niyo kanina na kailangan nating tingnan mula sa simula, ano ba talaga yung problema? Diba? Out-migration. Alam natin na for the past 40 years, yung out-migration is mas marami compared yung pabalik. But lately, we have encountered that dito sa COVID-19. Mayroong umuwi na more than 2 million. So dito natin nalaman na talagang kung ano yung programa natin for reintegration is not enough. Kaya sabi niyo po kanina, which is hindi naman in-encourage natin yon sa batas natin. We don't encourage na magtrabaho yung mga kababayan natin abroad. Pero let's admit it na kung may magandang oportunidad dito sa atin at alam natin yan, why we have to go out? So kaya yun yung dapat nating tutukan. Dito sa bagong batas, kaya nga doon sa Section 17, it's a full cycle comprehensive national reintegration program. What we are actually aiming is that, kagaya sabi niyo, from the time na bago pa lang umalis, we're looking into like, hindi yung mag-abroad kasi may tawag din PEDOS, yung pre-departure orientation seminar. What we are trying to is, PEMOS is pre-migration orientation seminar. In what way? Doon kasi sa LGU, kailangan tingnan natin down doon sa local level na kasama yung pamilya, dapat yung mga partners natin like PESO o kaya mga civil societies magkaroon na ng seminar na kasama yung pamilya about financial literacy, whatever yung family relations. Kasi pag hindi po yun na natutukan, pag abroad, minsan yung purpose na para sa pamilya, hindi minsan natutupad. And I can say na may mga kasamahan ako na nagkakaroon ng ibang pamilya habang nasa ibang bansa. So what's the point kung nasisira yung pamilya, which is the social cause of migration? That's pre-migration orientation seminar. Kagaya sabi niya, dapat dito pa lang tinitrain na natin. And we have partners with, of course, a bank and the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas who are providing the pitaka, yung financial na talino at kaalaman para doon sa mga umaalis at saka yung nandoon na sa abroad. Then doon din sa abroad, while on post, we were going to, may mga partners din kami, mga training centers at sa mga Philippine Professional Organization para din sa financial literacy at saka yung pagtuturo ng basic entrepreneurial skills. Para pagdating dito, nakaready na po. Pero mayroon po tayong challenge. I will admit na ang datos, yung po ang importante sa ngayon. Kaya isa sa mga tututukan at tinututukan is yung profiling ng mga pauwing OFW para alam mo kung ano yung skills nila at ano ang gusto nila. Kasi hindi po pwedeng ito isusubo mo na lang. Kasi minsan ayaw naman eh. Ako, nurse ako, pero gusto mo bang magbenta lang ako ng somewhere dito? Hindi naman siguro yun ang gusto ko. So we have to profile yung OFW na pauwi para alam natin kung saan natin sila ipapartner doon sa mga partner din ng mga NGOs, which is dito na sa return and reintegration. Doc?
The comment of the former PS president brings back to the gut question, what does the Philippines want to begin with? Because in 1974, migration is a stopgap measure. And 47 years after, 48 years after, now that we are in a pandemic, it remains the same. But reintegration is there. So I think some analysts are kind of dumbfounded about it. You want to bring them home, but the country wants to send them out anyway. So I guess the answer to that lies in government policy, not just migration, but also overall development policy. Of course, we could only hope that Ambition 2040 works so that migration is not anymore something that is forced upon them by economic circumstances. We would want them that overseas Filipinos, especially this new generation, would prepare eventually to come back home. And then when they do, the Philippines is ready. The businesses are ready. The ease of doing business is okay. If there are problems, then definitely the social welfare agencies are available. Civil society groups are there. But if I may, noticeably, probably because also of the pandemic, I don't know if you wonder that in many host countries, they're trying to win back those who went home because they need workers too. And now they're offering permanent residency opportunities. And I don't know if that is something to think about in terms of how reintegration would like to welcome them or not. Because if that is the case, definitely they're not coming back. But how can reintegration accommodate them and their family decision to say else?
Thank you, Jeremiah and Asek. Any more questions on migration, reintegration? Maybe to answer Alex tomorrow, our session, the third session, we will answer a portion of that because part of the book, part of our contribution in the book for Secretary Balisacan, we answered the policies that more or less push the workers to go out. So it's going to be answered tomorrow in a more detailed context. But let me say that if we think about it, the previous session talked about land, talked about agriculture. Is it more beneficial to run a farm than just to go abroad? So that's, I think, a very basic question that many people in the rural area are grappling with and are choosing to go abroad rather than tend their farms. And our policies has to tilt somewhere in between. As long as it's expensive, very difficult and complicated to do agriculture, there will be a large flows, initially going to the urban areas and then eventually abroad of our working people, particularly of our farmers and fisher folks. Sige. One last na, Alexa.
Papahiwatig na yata. This is a basic question. Kasi kita mo, ang daming agencies involved. No? But there a big part of the problem is in your presentation, Doc Jeremiah, is hindi the lack of data. Is that data is captured but it's not shared or it's not digitally. Limbawa, sabi ko kay Asik, di ba when people arrive, you have this information captured by the Bureau of Immigration. No? So it reminds me of what Jack Welch of GE was saying as early as 40 years ago. Sabi niya, I wish GE knew what GE knew. Meaning this data, this information resides somewhere in the bowels of other government agencies, except that it is not captured in a single database. Singapore is a very good example of having an integrated database. But then they only have 2 to 3 million people in population. Ano? So if there's one challenge, the management principle is that you cannot manage what you do not know. Di ba? And as Asek Legaspi and I were saying, even in the remittances numbers, distorted din yun. Kasi the number is skewed towards the US kasi pareho kami naggaling sa bangko. Lahat ng galing sa Africa, Europe, or Saudi Arabia, pag dumaan sa Money Center Bank in New York, it's tagged as coming from the US. So you don't really know where it's coming from. Di ba? But I tell you, those data is available at the bank level. Alam nila kung saan yung source doon. No? So to me, the number one challenge before you can even get to do your job properly is to assess exactly what information is available in each of these agencies and put it, maraming turf issues yan. Kanya-kanyang agency, I own this data. I will not be willing to share this with you. So good luck, Asek, on your job. But I would challenge you to have a roadmap on how to put that together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Before we close this session, let me just answer Alex. Actually, there were 2 laws that have been passed on integration of data from different agencies for migrant workers. It has been a turf issue, like you said. Is it DOLE? Is it DFA? Is it BSP? So there is that interagency committee that's supposed to be doing that. So ASEC challenge po yun. Right. So with that, we'd like to thank our colleague Dr. Jeremiah Opiniano, ASEC Venecio Legaspi, and our sponsor, Sophie Atanasio of the FNF. Thank you so much and good afternoon.